I'm going to finish up today's podcast by going over the Republican National Convention, the virtual convention that concluded last night. It was capped off by a very impassioned, lengthy speech by President Trump, basically glorifying his presidency and asking the voters for 4 more years. There was a lot of applause. A lot of Republicans are anxious to give the president 4 more years. And, again, there's a lot about what the president said and a lot of what a lot of other Republicans said that, that I like. I mean, I just wish it was true. I mean, some of the stuff was true. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump has not done anything good as president. Look, he hasn't gotten us into war. I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, there are a lot of presidents that have blundered us into war, and that hasn't happened. So we've basically had, 4 years of relative peace. And so, I got to give the president credit for that. And so, yes, I mean, could President Trump have done a worse job? Of course, he could have done a much worse job. The problem is, by pretending to do a great job, I think he has done an incredible disservice to the Republican Party, but more importantly, to the cause of limited government, freedom, the Constitution, sound money. There are a lot of people within the Republican Party who have really swallowed their principles in order to support President Trump. And President Trump doesn't actually admit that he has rejected these principles. He still pretends that he is espousing them. He doesn't want to disappoint his base by basically saying, look, you got no choice. You got to settle for me. I mean, when you heard his daughter talking, right, and she's bragging about all of these big government policies regarding mandatory family leave and other things like that, which she admits are not traditionally Republican issues. Right, they're traditionally Democratic issues because they involve government overreach. They involve government trying to interfere with private contracts. They're trying to force employees to accept benefits that the government thinks they should have rather than other benefits, including higher wages, that they would prefer. So now you're substituting the government coercion for voluntary interaction, and the crowd is applauding as Trump's daughter is talking about the fact that her father is pushing the nation to the left when it comes to labor law, as if this is a good thing. But worse than that, it is all of the big government spending, the failure of the president to address entitlements, not only his failure to address them in that he didn't cut them, he enabled them to get bigger and bigger. And he signed on to more spending for welfare, more spending for warfare. It's one thing to say, yes, he kept us out of war, but we certainly spent a lot more money, almost as if we were in war. At least nobody was dying, but we were still spending money on the military like we were at war. And so where'd all this money come from? To me, the biggest difference today between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is that the Democratic Party is promising bigger government, and they will deliver bigger government, except they want to pretend that the rich are going to pay for it. Now, the rich will pay for some of it, but they're not going to pay for all of it. The middle class and the poor are going to end up paying for a lot of the cost of bigger government. But the Democrats pretend that they're going to get that for nothing because the rich are going to pay for it. Now, when it comes to the Republicans, they're also promising bigger government, and they will deliver bigger government. They just are promising to make government bigger, but not as bigger as the Democrats would make it. So the Democrats want a lot more government every year, and the Republicans want somewhat less more government every year. So both parties want to make government bigger. The question is, at what rate do they want to make it bigger? The Democrats want to make it bigger faster than the Republicans, although when it comes to defense spending, the Republicans probably want to increase spending on defense more than the Democrats want to increase spending on defense, but the Democrats want to increase welfare spending more than the Republicans want to increase welfare spending, but they all want to increase welfare spending. But the big difference, again, is that while the Democrats pretend that the rich have to pay for all this extra government. The Republicans pretend that nobody has to pay for all this extra government, because at the same time the Republicans are delivering bigger government, they also want to promise tax cuts for everybody, including the rich, which makes even less sense. At least the Democrats are pretending that somebody has to pay for the extra government, even if it's not going to be adequate to pay for it. But the Republicans don't even bother with the pretense that anybody has to pay for anything. They want to say that everything is free. It is the ultimate free lunch when it comes to Republicans. We can make government bigger, we can cut everybody's taxes, and it's going to be great. No one has to pay for anything. And this is what makes everything so frustrating when I keep hearing the people who are speaking at the Republican convention, including Trump, warning that if we elect Biden, he's going to raise taxes. But that's exactly what Trump has been doing, even though he doesn't admit to doing it, because he's increasing government spending. And the minute you increase government spending, you've increased taxes, because every dollar the government spends is a dollar of taxes, because that's a dollar that the government is taking out of the private sector, and the private sector is going to have to pay for that dollar one way or another. And so Trump is raising taxes. He's just not raising them as much as Clinton might have, or as much as Biden will. And of course, even if Trump gets reelected, he is going to increase taxes by making government bigger. The only real difference is what type of tax. The Democrats want to raise income taxes on the rich and inflation taxes on everybody else. And the Republicans just want to raise inflation taxes on everybody. But that's where both parties seem to agree. Everybody likes the inflation tax, except nobody wants to admit that it's a tax or that anybody has to pay it. So again, it's very frustrating. A lot of the sentiments that are being expressed by a lot of the Republicans, including the president, are genuine, and I agree with. And much of the criticism of the left and socialism and what Biden is saying, I agree with. But you can't just criticize socialism with your words. You have to criticize it with your deeds. You can't practice socialism and condemn it at the same time, right? I mean, it's unfortunate. Some of the speakers mentioned that Bernie Sanders, right, his radical left-wing socialist policies are now mainstream within the Democratic Party. And that's true. But the unfortunate reality is that some of those policies are now mainstream in the Republican Party, too. There are a lot of things that the Republicans are now supporting that might have been too radical for Bernie Sanders. So Sanders has influenced both the Republican and the Democratic Party. So it's very disingenuous to criticize the Democratic brand of socialism while you're advocating a Republican brand of socialism. You have to be consistent. You have to criticize socialism in all of its forms. And if you want to preach an anti-socialist agenda, then you better practice it. Because by preaching capitalism and practicing socialism, you are giving capitalism a bad name, and you are opening up the door for socialism to take hold. Because when you practice socialism and preach capitalism, all the damage that gets done by the socialism gets blamed on the capitalism. And then the solution ends up being more socialism. So it's very unfortunate that Trump couldn't actually have pursued a different agenda during the last 4 years, actually reduced government spending, made government smaller so that he could have legitimately lowered taxes. Had he done something about the ticking entitlement time bomb, had he done something to help take the pressure off the Federal Reserve to keep monetizing debt, had we had some kind of return to normalcy in monetary policy, meaning had interest rates been allowed to rise much higher so that these bubbles would not have grown to this enormity. But of course, that's not what Trump wanted. Trump didn't want the hard way. He wanted the easy way. He didn't want to really make America great again. He just wanted to pretend to make America great again. His real goal was to keep the bubbles from popping, right? To keep the illusion alive, to keep reality delayed long enough to get a second term. And look, if I was still voting, which I can't do, yes, I would vote for Trump over Biden. But, I would probably vote libertarian Jo Jorgensen. I mean, she's got no chance of winning. But in Connecticut, neither does Trump. So voting for Trump is as big a waste as voting Libertarian. So I may have voted Libertarian because then you don't have to vote for the lesser of two evils. But, I'd still rather vote for good than the lesser of two evils because the lesser of two evils is still evil. Now, the question is, does Donald Trump actually know any of this stuff? Does Trump actually believe what he's saying or not? I don't know. I mean, when he told everybody that his steaks were the greatest steaks in the world, did he actually believe that? Or was he just saying that to sell his steaks? I don't know. Maybe he really did think they were the greatest steaks in the world. I kind of doubt it because I'm sure he's eaten some pretty good steaks in his life. I mean, he could afford the best steaks, and I'm sure those Trump steaks weren't the best steaks, but they certainly were when he was trying to sell them. So is he trying to sell a Trump presidency, a second term, the same way he was trying to sell his steaks by telling the voters what the voters want to hear, just like he was telling steak buyers what they wanted to hear? Or, does he really believe what he's saying? Does he really not understand that by increasing government spending, he's increasing taxes? Does he really not understand the negative consequences of these artificially low interest rates and blowing up a stock market bubble? Because it certainly sounded like he understood it when he was a candidate and when he was criticizing the Fed for keeping interest rates artificially low and blowing up a stock market bubble. It seemed to me that he understood the problems of the trade deficit when he was running as a candidate. And now the trade deficits are bigger than ever. Look at the trade numbers that came out today. It was horrific. I mean, our trade balance has gotten much worse under Trump, yet that didn't stop him from claiming that he had some major victory when it comes to trade. I mean, he's claiming that he resurrected American industry, that he put a stop to all the job losses and all the factories that shut down and moved out of the country. None of that has stopped. None of that has changed. The trade deficits are bigger. They're not smaller. Yes, he ran promising smaller trade deficits. In fact, one of the things that Trump said in his speech was that he's the only president that has kept all of his promises. Well, what about the promise to shrink the trade deficit? He didn't keep that. What about the promise to pay off the national debt? He didn't keep that. What about making America great again? He didn't even come close to doing that. There are a lot of promises that the president didn't keep. And that is what is so, again, frustrating about watching this, because I realize that as bad as the Republicans are, the Democrats are so much worse. That is the predicament that we're in, right? So what are you going to do?